a grandmother stood on stage and said something to Simon Cowell. The 3,000-seat theater fell into complete silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you hear when someone forgets their lyrics, or when a performance goes wrong. This was different. This was the kind of silence that happens when something so raw, so honest, so unexpectedly human occurs that every single person in the room forgets to breathe. The cameras stopped moving. The producers in the control room froze. And Simon Cowell, the man known for his razor-sharp critiques and emotionless demeanor, had tears streaming down his face. But how did we get here? What could an elderly woman possibly say on a talent show stage that would shatter the composure of one of the most stoic figures in television history? Let's go back to where it all started. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Los Angeles, and the America's Got Talent auditions were running like clockwork. Act after act walked onto that iconic stage, some receiving standing ovations, others getting buzzed off before they could finish. Simon sat at the judges' table with his usual posture, arms crossed, expression unreadable, pen tapping against the desk in a rhythm only he understood. The production assistant called out the next number. Number 847, Margaret Hayes. The stage doors opened, and an elderly woman walked out. She was in her mid-70s, gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, wearing a simple floral dress that looked like it had been carefully pressed that morning. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, the kind that comes not from wealth or status, but from decades of living with purpose. The audience offered polite applause. Simon glanced down at his notes, already preparing his usual opening question. But before he could speak, Margaret raised her hand gently, a small gesture that somehow commanded the entire room's attention. "Before I begin," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I need to tell you something." Simon looked up. There was something in her tone, something he couldn't quite place. He'd heard thousands of contestants over the years, each with their own story, their own reason for being there. But this felt different. "I'm 73 years old," Margaret continued. "And 6 months ago, I lost my husband of 52 years. The theater shifted. You could feel it, the way the energy in a room changes when something real enters the space. Simon's pen stopped tapping. The other judges leaned forward slightly. Even the audience members who had been checking their phones put them away. But what Margaret said next would change everything. Not just for that day, not just for that season, but for the way Simon Cowell would see his role as a judge for the rest of his career. Margaret took a small breath and continued. "My husband, Robert, was a musician. Not a famous one, not someone you'd ever hear on the radio. But he played the piano every single evening in our living room. For 52 years, I fell asleep to the sound of him playing." She paused, and for the first time, her voice wavered slightly. "When he passed, the house became so quiet. Too quiet. I didn't know how to live in that silence." Simon's expression had changed. The usual mask of critical detachment was gone. His arms were no longer crossed. He was simply listening, the way you listen when someone is telling you something that matters. "So I did something I'd never done before," Margaret said. "I learned to play the piano myself. Because I needed to hear that music again. I needed to fill the silence." She walked over to the piano that had been set up on stage. It was a beautiful instrument, black and gleaming under the stage lights. She sat down on the bench, adjusted her position, and placed her hands gently on the keys. "This was Robert's favorite song," she said quietly. "And tonight, I'm playing it for him." The first notes filled the theater. It was a classical piece, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, but she played it with a tenderness that transcended technical perfection. Every note seemed to carry weight, memory, love. Her eyes were closed, and as her fingers moved across the keys, you could see decades of devotion in every movement. The audience was completely still. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the rustle of clothing. Just the music, pure and heartbreaking and beautiful. Simon sat frozen at the judge's table. His hand had moved to his mouth, a gesture he rarely made in public. His eyes, usually so guarded, were beginning to glisten. When Margaret reached the final chord, she held it, letting it resonate through the theater until it faded into silence. She lifted her hands from the keys slowly, as if saying goodbye to something precious. The silence that followed was profound. And then something unprecedented happened. Simon Cowell stood up. He didn't wait for the other judges to react. He didn't look at the cameras or check with the producers. He simply stood, walked around the judges' table, and began moving toward the stage. The audience gasped. Howie Mandel's mouth fell open. Heidi Klum's hand went to her chest. Simon climbed the steps onto the stage, something he almost never did during auditions. He walked directly to Margaret, who was still sitting at the piano, her hands folded in her lap. What Simon did next broke every rule in the show's format. The producers were frantically whispering into their headsets. The cameras scrambled to adjust. But Simon didn't care about any of it. He knelt down beside the piano bench so he was at eye level with Margaret. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at her, this woman who had just laid her soul bare in front of millions, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Margaret, he said quietly, though the microphones picked up every word. In all my years of doing this show, I've heard incredible voices. I've seen unbelievable talent. I've watched people achieve things I didn't think were possible. He paused, and when he continued, there were tears visible in his eyes. But what you just did, that wasn't just a performance. That was love. That was 52 years of love, translated into music. Margaret's own eyes filled with tears. He would have loved this moment, she whispered. Simon reached out and took her hand, a gesture so tender and un-Simon-like that several audience members began to cry. He's here, Simon said. I promise you, he heard every note. The theater erupted. Not in applause yet, but in the sound of 3,000 people collectively releasing the breath they'd been holding. Tissues were being pulled from purses. Grown men were wiping their eyes. The other judges were openly weeping at their table. Simon helped Margaret stand, and as she did, she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Her hands were shaking as she unfolded it. Before Robert passed, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, he wrote me a letter. He told me that if I ever felt lost without him, I should do something that scared me. Something that would remind me I was still alive. She looked at Simon with watery eyes. Standing on this stage terrified me. But he was right. I feel alive again. Simon's professional composure, the armor he'd built over decades in the entertainment industry, completely shattered. A tear rolled down his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. He took the letter from Margaret's trembling hands and read it silently, his lips moving slightly with the words. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her. Then he did something no one expected. He pulled Margaret into a gentle embrace, right there on stage, under the lights, in front of everyone. The audience rose to their feet. The standing ovation wasn't polite or performative. It was thunderous, cathartic, a collective release of emotion. People weren't just clapping for Margaret's performance. They were honoring her courage, her love, her refusal to let grief silence her completely. Subscribe now, because what happens next will show you a side of Simon Cowell you've never seen before. When Simon finally released Margaret from the embrace, he walked back to the judges' table, but he didn't sit down. He stood behind his chair, one hand gripping the back of it for support. He looked at the other judges, then at the audience, then back at Margaret. I'm not going to critique that, he said, his voice still rough with emotion. I'm not going to tell you what you did right or wrong, because that's not what this was about. He paused, gathering himself. What you just shared with us, Margaret, that's why this show exists. Not for perfect pitch or flawless technique, but for moments like this. Real moments. Human moments. Howie Mandel was the first to speak from the judges' panel. Margaret, he said, his own voice thick, you came here looking to fill the silence. But you did something more. You filled our hearts. Heidi Klum nodded, tears streaming down her face. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed on this stage. Your husband would be so proud of you." Sofia Vergara, usually the most composed of the judges, couldn't speak. She simply pressed her hand to her heart and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Simon took a breath. He looked at Margaret standing on that stage, still holding her late husband's letter, and he made a decision. "Margaret," he said, his hand moving slowly toward the judges' table, "I want to do something I've never done for someone like you." His fingers hovered over the golden buzzer, that iconic button that sends an act straight to the live shows. "Not because you're going to win this competition. Not because you have the best technical skills. But because what you represent, what you just showed us, deserves to be celebrated on the biggest stage possible." And then he slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling, cascading down like metallic rain. The music swelled. The audience went absolutely wild, people jumping to their feet, screaming, crying, holding each other. Margaret stood in the center of it all, her hands covering her face as she sobbed with relief and joy and grief and love all tangled together. Simon came back onto the stage, walking through the falling confetti. He took Margaret's hands again and said something to her that the microphones couldn't quite catch, but you could read his lips. "You gave him the most beautiful gift." But this moment didn't just end when the cameras stopped rolling. What happened backstage would reveal just how deeply this performance had affected Simon Cowell. After the confetti stopped falling and the audience's applause finally died down, Margaret was escorted backstage by production staff. The standard protocol was for golden buzzer recipients to do quick interviews, take photos, and then head home. But Simon didn't follow protocol that day. He went backstage himself, something he rarely did during audition rounds. He found Margaret in the waiting area, sitting on a couch, still clutching her husband's letter. She looked up when he entered, surprised to see him. "I'm sorry," Simon said, sitting down beside her. "I just needed to tell you something away from the cameras." Margaret waited, her expression open and kind. "My father passed away several years ago," Simon said quietly. "And I never really dealt with it properly. I just kept working, kept moving forward, kept building this empire of television shows and music labels. I thought that's what you were supposed to do. Stay strong. Don't show weakness." He looked down at his hands. "But watching you tonight, seeing your courage in facing your grief and transforming it into something beautiful, it made me realize I'd been doing it wrong." Margaret reached over and patted his hand, the gesture so maternal, so full of understanding. "Grief doesn't make us weak," she said gently. "It makes us human. And being human is the bravest thing we can be." Simon nodded, his throat tight. "When I go home tonight, I'm going to take out the box of my father's things that I've kept locked away. And I'm going to remember him properly. Because of you. Then we both found what we needed tonight," Margaret said with a soft smile. Simon stayed backstage talking with Margaret for another 20 minutes, long after the producers started looking for him. They talked about loss, about love, about how we honor the people we've lost by continuing to live fully. By the time Simon returned to the judges' table, something fundamental had shifted in him. The rest of the audition day felt different. Simon was still Simon, still honest and critical when performances didn't meet the standard. But there was a new gentleness in how he delivered his feedback, a recognition that behind every person on that stage was a whole universe of experiences and emotions. When the episode aired months later, it broke viewership records. The moment went viral across every social platform. Millions of people shared the clip with captions like, "This restored my faith in humanity," and, "If Simon Cowell can cry, anyone can." But for those who were actually in the theater that day, it wasn't about going viral or breaking records. It was about witnessing something authentic in a world that often feels scripted and shallow. Margaret Hayes didn't win America's Got Talent that season. She made it to the semifinals and performed one more time, another piece her husband had loved. When she was eliminated, she left the stage with grace and gratitude, the same way she'd entered it. But her impact lasted far longer than any trophy could have. Simon Cowell still talks about that audition. In interviews, when asked about his most memorable moment as a judge, he doesn't mention the biggest stars or the viral acts. He mentions Margaret, the grandmother who taught him that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that the most powerful performances aren't always the loudest ones. They're the ones that come from the heart. Share this story if it touched you. Subscribe so you never miss moments that remind us what it means to be human. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand on stage and tell the truth.